Right now, somewhere in the world, an AK-47 is being fired. Not by an army, not in a war zone you'd recognize from the news. It's estimated that 1 out of every 60 people on this planet has access to this rifle. Let that sink in for a second, because the story of how that happened has almost nothing to do with what most people assume. Because here's the truth. The AK-47 doesn't dominate battlefields, insurgencies, and conflict zones across 6 continents because it outshoots its rivals. It dominates because of a design philosophy that most Western militaries didn't fully understand until decades after Mikhail Kalashnikov's rifle was already everywhere. And once you see what that philosophy actually was, you'll never look at the best weapon the same way again. So here's where this video is going. First, we'll look at the man who designed it and the battlefield lesson that shaped every decision he made. Then we'll break down exactly what the AK-47 sacrifices compared to more accurate rifles, and why that sacrifice was the entire point. We'll examine how it spread across the world at a scale no firearm in history has matched. We'll look at the human cost of a weapon this simple to use. And by the end, you'll understand why not the best and the most feared were never actually in contradiction. The first thing you need to understand is where this rifle came from. Mikhail Kalashnikov served in the Red Army during World War II, and according to several sources, his design instincts were shaped directly by what he saw on the battlefield. Soviet soldiers outgunned by the superior firepower of German infantry weapons, and in particular, impressed by the German STG-44, one of the first true assault rifles ever fielded in combat. Kalashnikov wasn't trying to build a marksman's weapon. He was trying to solve a much blunter problem. How do you put a weapon in the hands of a poorly trained conscript in the worst possible conditions and guarantee it fires when he pulls the trigger? That single design priority explains almost everything that followed. The rifle was formally adopted by the Soviet Red Army in 1949, and its entire engineering philosophy centered on one word: reliability, not precision. And here's where it gets interesting, because that trade-off was deliberate. The second thing you need to understand is what the AK-47 actually gives up to achieve that reliability. Its parts are loosely fitted, with generous clearances between the moving components. To an engineer trained in Western precision manufacturing, that looks like a flaw. It isn't. Those loose tolerances are exactly why the rifle keeps firing when it's caked in mud, packed with sand, or hasn't been cleaned in weeks. Conditions that would jam a more precisely machined rifle almost immediately. The AK-47 trades accuracy at long range for something insurgents, conscripts, and irregular fighters have valued far more throughout history: a weapon that simply does not stop working. This is the contra-intuitive turn worth sitting with, because Western militaries spent decades designing rifles for trained marksmen fighting in relatively controlled conditions, prioritizing accuracy and range. Kalashnikov designed for the opposite scenario entirely: minimal training, brutal conditions, and soldiers who needed a weapon that worked every single time, even if it wasn't going to win a precision shooting competition. It wasn't a worse rifle. It was a rifle built for a completely different kind of war. And as it turned out, that kind of war, messy, low training, high attrition, is the kind most of the world has actually fought since 1950. Let's talk about how this rifle spread, because the scale is almost impossible to overstate. It's estimated that roughly 100 million AK pattern rifles have been produced worldwide, making it one of the most manufactured firearms in human history. Part of that spread was ideological. The Soviet Union and its allies distributed the design and manufacturing rights across the Eastern Bloc and beyond, turning the AK-47 into a symbol as much as a weapon. It appeared in the hands of revolutionary movements from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Mozambique, where it's stitched directly onto the national flag. Part of that spread was simply economic. The rifle is cheap enough to manufacture, and cheap enough to buy on the black market that it became the default weapon for guerrilla movements, criminal organizations, and standing armies alike, often for a fraction of the cost of Western equivalents. Here's the moment that reveals why this matters beyond the battlefield. Because a rifle that's simple enough for a poorly trained fighter to strip, clean, and reassemble in the dark is also simple enough to hand to a child soldier, to a militia with no formal training pipeline, to anyone with a few dollars and no oversight whatsoever. The same design philosophy that made the AK-47 legendary for reliability is exactly what made it the weapon of choice for the ugliest conflicts of the last 70 years. Civil wars, insurgencies, and militias operating far outside any formal chain of command. That's the human cost side of this story that rarely gets discussed alongside the engineering praise. A weapon this easy to use doesn't just arm soldiers, it arms almost anyone. Why does this still matter today in an era of precision-guided munitions and drone warfare? Because the AK-47 proves something that modern military planners still wrestle with, that in the wars actually being fought around the world, the deciding factor often isn't which side has the most sophisticated weapon. It's which side has a weapon that works, that's cheap enough to distribute at massive scale, and that doesn't require years of training to operate effectively. Every modern debate about arming irregular forces, insurgencies, and low-training militias still runs into the same lesson Kalashnikov learned on the Eastern Front decades ago. The word to carry with you here is reliable. Not deadly, not advanced, not precise. Reliable. That was the entire design brief, and it's the reason a rifle that loses almost every head-to-head accuracy comparison against its Western rivals became the most produced, most distributed, and most feared weapon on the planet. Reliable is a boring word for a terrifying legacy, but it's the only word that actually explains it. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the deadliest weapon in modern history became dominant not because it was the best, but because it was simple enough for anyone to use, what does that tell you about where the next generation of dangerous weapons might come from? Tell me in the comments whether you think simple and reliable still beats advanced and precise in the wars being fought today. If this kind of design history is interesting to you, let me know which weapon's real story you want broken down next. There's a lot more behind these iconic pieces of hardware than the specifications ever tell you. Share this with anyone who assumes the best weapon always wins, and subscribe if you want more of this kind of analysis that goes past the specs and into why weapons actually succeed or fail in the real world.